If you think about Descartes' starting point, his own existence, and you think about the knowledge that he has bracketed and assumed to be false, namely knowledge of real-world objects, things like tables and chairs, plants, animals, houses, people, it becomes clear that he's got a big problem. And that problem is, how does he get from his own existence to once again believing in the certainty of his sensorial experiences, his experiences of the surrounding world? Okay, now I agree with you. I think he's actually got a lot of problems. I could never have conceived of a text like the Meditations. The idea of systematically doubting everything, believing that maybe this is all a dream or all a lie, is honestly not something that I would ever seriously entertain. But it is an interesting thought for the journey, at the very least, and for the ideas that it leads to. Okay, but how can Descartes get from his own existence to once again retrieving the knowledge that he has bracketed? Okay, the curtain, if you guys have seen the Monday lecture, the curtain of doubt. How can he get to those real-world objects once more? And the answer is, at least the answer that he comes up with, these are the real-world objects here. Here are the cars. This is like a 1970s car. Most cars are sportier now. The answer that he comes up with is that if he can prove God's existence, then he can once again trust his senses. Okay, in other words, God is a way around the curtain of doubt that he has carved out for himself. If you think about the three arguments for God's existence that we looked at when we covered Aquinas, the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, and the teleological argument. Remember, the cosmological argument was the argument that said there had to have been a first thing, some uncaused cause, some unmoved mover that started it all. The ontological argument asserted that there has to be a greatest possible being that exists in reality. Because we can conceive of a greatest possible being, and if a greatest possible being exists only in our minds, then it wouldn't be the greatest possible being, because beings that have real existence would be greater. Therefore, ergo, the greatest possible being must exist in reality. And then the third argument for God's existence, the teleological argument, the argument from probability, which asserted that where there is something that is complex, it stands to reason that there's a complex source. And the universe, the world that we see around us, is for sure incredibly complex. Therefore, it stands to reason that God as the source, the source of the universe must be an intelligent designer, who we will call God. God is the source. Okay, so of those three arguments, cosmological, the ontological, and the teleological, only one is available to Descartes, given his starting assumptions. Because remember, he cannot appeal to the deliverances of his senses as a source of his proof of God's existence, because he is assuming that the deliverances of his senses are false. Only the ontological argument is available to him. Not the cosmological or the teleological argument, because both of those require an appeal to the senses and to information derived from the senses, and they require as an assumption that the senses which are telling us these things about the world are indeed trustworthy in what they say about the nature of the world. So Descartes uses the ontological arguments to demonstrate God's existence. And then on that basis, since God is the greatest possible being as defined by the ontological argument, God, according to Descartes, must be a truth teller. Okay, that's a key move. So God must be a truth teller because truth telling is superior to lie telling. And God, as a truth teller, must be guaranteeing his sensorial deliverances. In other words, God as the truth teller, since he is the greatest possible being, must be ensuring that the nature of the world is in fact more or less as Descartes perceives it to be. This doesn't necessarily mean that all of Descartes' sensory deliverances from here on out are things that he can trust or sources of certain knowledge, but it does mean that the general outline of the world delivered to him by his senses is something that he believes himself to be able to trust on the basis of God's existence. Notice once more that Descartes is the first modern here because he starts with his own existence and from there reasons to God's existence, and from there to the trustworthiness of his senses and the nature of the world. He does not start by assuming that his senses are reliable and or by assuming that a divine figure exists. He starts with anthropocentric sources. Again, a modern move. Now, I've been chatting for a little while. Let me stop and ask if there are questions or comments about any of this or reflections so far.
What caused him to not trust his senses?
Sure. That's great. Here's what I think. I've read the Meditations a few times, and here's what I think is going on there. I think Descartes is really impressed with mathematics. And what impresses him about mathematics as a form of knowledge is how certain it is. It's a form of knowledge that, we can all agree upon. You have a very different life perspective than I have. Others have a very different life perspective than either of us. And yet all of us, from our independent perspectives, can all look at particular equations and agree, yes, 11 plus 7 is 18. There's no dispute. It has to be that way. That sort of thing. He's really impressed with the certainty here. And when he looks at other forms of human knowledge, he realizes that there's a lot of uncertainty. Okay, so for example, there's a lot of uncertainty in philosophy. Right? Does God exist? Does he not exist? Different people of goodwill disagree. Are there moral universals? Is morality relative? Different people of goodwill disagree. Right? There's a lot of uncertainty in philosophy. But outside of philosophy, there's a lot of uncertainty too in other fields. Okay, let's even take some of the soft sciences. In biology, there's a ton of uncertainty. Okay, some say, is natural selection processes. Others say, no, actually, natural selection as a mechanism does not explain common descent. There are lots of gaps that can't actually be explained by natural selection. There are all sorts of disputes in biology as soft science. The harder you go in the sciences towards physics, the hardest of all, right, mathematics, these demand greater certainty. Okay, and there's greater consensus, at least in some respects. But the softer you go towards the social sciences, the more dispute there is. Descartes is really profoundly impressed, I think, by the certainty that comes from mathematics. And he thinks that if he can introduce certainty like that into philosophy, then he's going to give us a new start. There's all this to do in the 16th century, 17th century. It's exhibited in Descartes' Meditations about a new start, rebelling against the ancients, doing away with received knowledge, coming up with our own ideas. Let's get a new start in the world. And I think he thinks that if we can put the humanities and philosophy in particular on a foundation of absolute certainty, then we can achieve the level of agreement that is achieved in mathematics. Now, I think this is profoundly arrogant as a project. I think it's just not in the nature of a human endeavor to achieve certainty about certain kinds of topics, including especially the topics that Descartes is talking about. But I think that that's why he decides to doubt everything. I think it's just an experiment so that he can try to achieve this certainty that he witnesses, observes in mathematics. He's a big mathematician, and he wanted to apply mathematics to other fields, which is not a bad idea. A lot of fields have been revolutionized over the centuries by applications of mathematics. I'm not so sure that philosophy is improved by its encounter with mathematics. Good question, thank you. Yes?
I thought he went through an existential crisis. That's why he doubted everything.
That's what he says. I have wondered if that's a literary device. So it could be the case. It could be that the story he's telling us, this folksy story about sitting by the fire in his nightgown and all that, is the case. It could be the case that he goes through a real existential crisis. I guess both could actually be true simultaneously as explanations for the meditations and where this approach to philosophy comes from. Knowing a few other things about Descartes, based outside of our lecture today, and about the legacy he wanted to leave in history, he was profoundly aware of his own legacy and wanted posterity and future generations to have a particular perception of him. Knowing about Descartes and the legacy he wanted, I wonder if a lot of the discussion of existential crisis and all that is just a literary device to interest us in his process. I don't know, that's just speculation, but could be. Good, other questions? All right, folks, I'm going to go to a PowerPoint now to talk about the meditation. I apologize that I'm not able to sustain my energy much longer, but I will do my best through the use of a PowerPoint.